My name is Isaiah. I am 53 years old, and I have been sold twice in my life. The first time I was a boy, young enough to cry, old enough to know that crying would cost me. The second time I was a grown man standing in the dust of Willow Bend, barefoot, shoulders burned raw by the sun, while a man with yellow teeth shouted my price to a crowd that laughed. $2. That was what I was worth on that afternoon. Less than a lame horse, less than a sack of grain left too long in the rain. I kept my eyes on the ground because I had learned, the hard way, that looking up was an invitation to pain. I was not a man in that moment. I was an object, a remainder of war, and I believed, with everything broken inside me, that I would die as one. If this touched something in your heart, if you have ever felt invisible, counted out, worth less than you truly are, then stay with me. This story is not easy, but it is real, and it changed my life forever. Hit that like button, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from today. Your support means more than you know. It helps me keep telling stories like this one, stories that deserve to be heard. Now, let me tell you what happened next, because what that woman did with 2 silver coins was only the beginning. But something happened that day that I cannot fully explain, even now, all these years later. A sound cut through the laughter, the soft rustle of silk dragging across dry dirt, and 2 silver coins striking a man's palm like a thunderclap. What followed those 2 coins changed everything, not just for me, for every soul on that land, for every neighbor who had learned to look away. I did not know it yet, standing there in the dust with my wrists still marked from old iron, but that was the moment my life split in two. Everything before those coins, and everything after. If you think you know how this story ends, I promise you, you do not. Willow Bend smelled like red clay and something always burning. The air there sat heavy on your chest, thick with heat and the sweetness of cotton that had been picked too many times by hands that never rested. The road into town was nothing but cracked earth and wagon ruts deep enough to break an ankle. The trees, old oaks mostly, leaned over the path like men too tired to stand straight anymore. The sky was wide and pale, bleached out by a sun that showed no mercy. I had passed through a dozen places like it, places where the buildings had paint peeling off like old skin, where the general store smelled of tobacco and mildew, where children stopped playing when a man like me walked by because they had already been taught what to think. Willow Bend was not the worst place I had ever been, but it was the loneliest. Before that auction, my days followed a rhythm that had nothing to do with living. I woke before the birds. I worked until my hands bled, and then I worked some more. I ate what was left. I slept on a floor that smelled of damp wood and other men's sorrow. I did not own a single thing in this world, not my boots, not my name when someone decided to call me something else, not the hours of my own life. I had learned to make myself small, to answer quickly, to disappear into the work so that no one would find a reason to single me out. That was survival, not living, surviving. There is a difference that only a man who has had everything taken from him can truly feel in his bones, deep as marrow. But the wound I carried that no one could see, the one that hurt worse than any whip, was the memory of my mother's voice. She used to hum while she worked, a low, steady sound like a river moving under ice. They took her from me when I was 11 years old. Sold her south, they said, as if south was just a direction and not a grave. I never heard her voice again, and every year that passed, I felt her face fading from my memory, and I could not stop it. That was the real chain, not the iron ones, the ones made of forgetting, of grief with nowhere to go. By the time I stood in that auction yard in Willow Bend, I had stopped believing that anything in this world could be given to me without a price far greater than I could pay. It happened fast, the way things that change your life always do. One moment I was standing in that dust, head down, listening to the auctioneer's voice bounce off the walls of indifferent men. The next I heard it, that sound, silk, moving against dry ground. I had never heard anything so out of place in my entire life. I risked a glance, just one, and there she was, a woman dressed in black mourning clothes, tall and straight-backed as a church door, walking through that crowd of men like she was parting water. Nobody laughed at her. Nobody said a word. She stopped directly in front of the auctioneer, opened a small leather purse, and without a single moment of hesitation, she placed 2 silver coins into his dirty palm. The crowd went absolutely silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. She had just bought me for the price of a decent meal. My first thought was not gratitude. I want to be honest about that. My first thought was, what does she want from me? Because, in my experience, kindness from a stranger always had a lock on the back of it. I searched her face for the sign, the slight curl of the lip, the cold calculation behind the eyes that told you exactly what kind of suffering was coming. But her face gave me nothing. No cruelty, no triumph, no pity either, which somehow frightened me more than anything else. She simply looked at me the way you look at a man. Not at a tool, not at a problem, at a man. Then she said 4 words, just 4, in a voice so quiet I almost missed them over the blood pounding in my ears. She said, "Follow me, please, Isaiah." She knew my name. I had never told it to anyone in that town. I followed her to a carriage waiting at the edge of the yard, an old mare, worn leather seats, a driver who kept his eyes forward and asked no questions. I walked behind, not beside. Habit dies slow, and with every step I waited for the world to show me its real face, for someone to grab my arm, for her to turn and laugh, for the trap to spring. But the road just stretched ahead, red and long, and the carriage moved slow enough that I could keep pace without running. By the time the rooftops of Willow Bend disappeared behind the tree line, something strange and dangerous had begun to stir inside my chest. Something I had buried so deep I had nearly forgotten its name. It was not hope yet. Hope was too large a word. It was the smallest possible version of it, just a crack in the wall, just enough light to make the darkness around it visible. The plantation had a name once. I never learned it. Everyone just called it Mabel's place, as if the land itself had taken her shape after her husband died. The first opposition came not from a man with a weapon, but from a woman with a broom. Her name was Dora, the housekeeper, wide as a door frame, with eyes that had seen too much and trusted too little. She blocked the kitchen entrance the moment I stepped onto the porch, arms crossed, jaw tight. She looked at me the way people look at weather they don't want. "We don't need more trouble here," she said, low and flat. Mabel stepped past her without a word and told me to sit at the table. Dora didn't move for a long moment. Then she moved, slow, like a woman deciding whether a storm was worth fighting. That kitchen felt smaller than a grave and twice as quiet. That night, lying on a cot that was the softest thing I had slept on in years, I could not close my eyes. My mind would not stop turning. I kept asking myself the question that had no safe answer. Why me? Out of every broken man standing in that yard, why had she chosen the one who cost the least? Was I a charity, an experiment, a shield for something I didn't yet understand? I thought about running. I mapped the roads in my head, calculated the distance to the tree line, weighed the risks the way a man does when his instincts and his exhaustion are pulling in opposite directions. But there was something else, too, something quieter than fear, the way she had said my name, not like a command, like she already knew me, like my name meant something to her that it had stopped meaning to me a long time ago. 3 days in, the second obstacle arrived on horseback, 2 of them, big men with the kind of stillness that comes from being used to getting what they want without asking twice. They tied their horses at the gate and walked up the path like they owned it, which I suspected was exactly what they believed. I was splitting wood near the barn when I saw them. One of them looked at me with that particular expression, the one that reduces a man to an inconvenience. The other one asked for Mabel by her first name, which was already an insult. I set the axe down slowly. Mabel came to the door. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. I could see them trembling slightly at her sides, pressed flat against her skirt so no one else would notice. But I noticed, and something inside me shifted, the way a heavy door shifts when someone finally puts their shoulder against it. I learned their names by listening through the wall that evening. Clarence Whitmore and his associate, a man called Reed, who smiled too much and meant none of it. Whitmore had been circling this land for over a year, ever since Mabel's husband, Edmund, had died and left behind debts that Whitmore claimed were owed to him. He wanted the land. He wanted Mabel gone. And men like Whitmore, I had learned long ago, did not stop wanting things simply because they were told no. That night, Mabel showed me a box of letters. Edmund's handwriting, shaky near the end. Letters that told a different story than Whitmore's. Letters that proved the debt had been paid. But the man who had witnessed the payment was dead, and the bank that held the record had burned down the previous winter. "Convenient," Mabel said, without a trace of surprise. Then came the night that broke me open. I was sitting on the porch steps when I heard Dora crying inside. Not loud, the kind of crying you do when you've practiced keeping it small. And I realized that everyone in that house was carrying something too heavy for one person alone. Mabel had lost her husband and was about to lose her land. Dora had buried 2 sons and kept working because stopping meant falling apart completely. And I had lost my mother, my name, my sense of being a man who mattered in this world. We were 3 people held together by little more than proximity and the stubborn refusal to give up. I put my head in my hands and I felt something crack inside my chest. Not break, not shatter, just crack, the way old wood does before it finally lets the light in. I did not know it yet, but that crack was the beginning of everything. It was Dora who found it. She had been cleaning behind the fireplace, the kind of deep, angry cleaning she did when her grief had nowhere else to go, when her hand hit something solid inside the old brick. A tin box, sealed with wax and wrapped in oilcloth to keep the damp out. Inside were letters. But not Edmund's letters. These were older, written in a hand I did not recognize, addressed to a man named Caleb, Edmund's father. And tucked beneath them, folded so many times the creases had gone white, was a document with a court seal still intact. It recorded a land grant, original, legal, signed by a federal officer in 1849. The land had never belonged to Whitmore's family, not 1 acre of it. Edmund had not borrowed against this land. He had inherited it clean, free of any debt, from a father who had fought to secure it legally. Everything Whitmore had claimed was built on a lie so old it had grown roots. I sat with that document in my hands for a long time. The candle burned low. Mabel read it 3 times, her lips moving slightly, like a woman making sure a miracle was real before she allowed herself to believe it. Then she looked at me. Not the way an owner looks at a possession, but the way one frightened person looks at another when they finally realize they are not alone. And I understood, in that moment, why she had come to that auction yard. Edmund's letters had mentioned a man sold through Willow Bend, a man her husband had once tried to help years before and failed. She had not chosen me randomly. She had been looking for someone she believed still had something unbroken inside him. Someone who understood what it meant to have the truth buried under someone else's lie. She had come to that yard not just to buy a man. She had come to find a witness. But having the truth in your hands and being able to use it are 2 entirely different things. That document meant nothing if we could not get it in front of someone with the power to act on it. And to do that, we had to move through a town that belonged to Whitmore in every way that mattered. His name on the bank, his cousin behind the sheriff's desk, his money in the pockets of men who made decisions. Mabel laid out the options on the kitchen table like cards in a losing hand. We could go to the county seat, 2 days' ride, and hope the judge there was honest. We could send word to the federal office in the capital and wait weeks for a response that might never come. Or we could stay, hold the land, and face whatever Whitmore sent next, which, based on what I had already seen, would not be lawyers. Every choice carried a price, and every price would be paid first by the people with the least protection. I made my decision before sunrise. I did not wake Mabel. I did not ask Dora's opinion. I took the document, wrapped it the way it had been found, and I walked into town alone in the dark. Not to the sheriff, not to the bank. I went to the church, the old Methodist one at the edge of town, where a minister named Elias kept records going back 30 years and had a reputation, rare as clean water in that county, for being afraid of no man living. I knocked on his door in the cold before dawn, and when he opened it, lamp in hand, I held up that document and I told him everything, every word. I did not tremble. I did not lower my eyes. I stood in that doorway as tall as I had ever stood in my life, and I spoke like a man who had finally remembered that the truth belonged to him too. That moment, that exact moment, was when I became myself again. They came that same night. I had expected torches, and torches they brought, 4 of them, orange and ugly against the black sky, carried by men in masks who believed that darkness gave them permission to be the worst version of themselves. But what Whitmore had not expected was that Minister Elias had spent the morning doing what men of genuine conscience do when they finally have something solid to stand on. He had talked to neighbors, to families who had watched Whitmore's shadow grow over that county for years and said nothing because saying something alone felt like stepping in front of a train. But together was a different calculation entirely. When those masked men reached the gate of Mabel's land, they did not find a widow and a man worth $2 standing alone in the dark. They found 31 people, farmers, mothers, an old veteran with one arm who stood straighter than anyone, all of them silent, all of them holding their ground like the earth itself had decided it was finished being pushed around. Whitmore pulled off his mask first. I think he believed that showing his face was a show of power, that his name alone would scatter us like startled birds. He was wrong. He looked at that crowd, and I watched something happen behind his eyes that I had never seen in a man like him before. He looked uncertain. The torch in his hand trembled slightly, just enough for the people nearest him to notice. Minister Elias stepped forward and read the document aloud, every word, every date, every seal, in a voice that carried clean and clear across that still night air. When he finished, nobody moved for a long moment. Then Whitmore's associate, Reed, the one who smiled too much, turned his horse around and rode away without a single word. One by one, the others followed. Whitmore was the last to go. He looked at me before he turned, really looked, the way a man looks when he realizes the story he has been telling himself has just been proven wrong. I did not look away, not even for a second. I have thought about those 2 silver coins every single day since that night, not because of what they bought, but because of what they refused to accept. They refused to accept that a man's worth could be shouted out loud in a dusty yard and settled for less than the price of a decent meal. Mabel never called me her servant, never called me her property. In time she called me her neighbor, and then, carefully, her friend. Dora eventually called me family, which coming from her was worth more than any document with a federal seal. I never found my mother. That wound did not close. It never fully does. But I carried her hum inside me through everything that followed, and I carry it still. What I know now, standing on this land that could not be taken, looking at fields that remember every pair of hands that ever worked them, is this: the men who put a price on you are never the ones who determine your value. That has always been, and will always be, yours alone to decide. Willow Bend never forgot what happened at that gate, and neither will I.